Gender theory denies science, fails to take into account the important work in science on gender itself, mainly undertaken by feminist scholars. The trans-exclusionary feminists tend to repeat the claim that disputing biological determinism should not lead to a refutation of biology. I agree. What is called gender theory has in fact been arguing that for some time. If we shift, for instance, from a deterministic model to an interactive one, as Anne Fausto Sterling and other scholars of science have been doing for some time, it turns out that what we call our biology is always interacting with social and environmental forces, and that we cannot really think about biological facts outside of this interaction. It is not as if biological causes stream in from one source and through a specific channel, whereas social determinants flow from another location only to meet up at some third site called the body. Biological and social forces are together interacting in embodied life. The development or formation of the organism presumes that the biological requires the social to be activated, and the social requires the biological to produce its effects. The one cannot act as a formative power without the other. The point can be simply made by considering how bodies are formed by the kinds of foods that are ingested, which in turn depend on what kinds of foods are produced and available. The social and economic infrastructure of food, including supply chains and unequal distribution, inhabits the materiality of the bodies in which we live. As should be obvious, nutrition affects the growth and density of our bones, the composition of our blood, and mortality rates. Nutrition may be one site where the co-construction of material and social lives is most obvious. But another example would be the effect of clean or polluted air on the body, its very capacity to breathe. As noted before, reproductive capacities cannot always be assumed, and some of them have to be activated for reproduction to occur. One of several reasons we cannot assume that women are defined by their reproductive capacity is simply that not everyone living in the category has that capacity or is compelled to make use of it. Both environment and desire are already at work in the making and unmaking of capacities. Sometimes a capacity only gets activated with a technological intervention, at which point the gestation can be understood as emerging from more than one agent, a complex interplay of human and technological powers. The model of co-construction comes into play here too. In any case, it is not to be assumed that a natural capacity is actually there, and it often turns out to be cruel to make that assumption. Sometimes the recourse to biological facts by anti-gender partisans is combined with a call to return to common sense. Occasionally, there is a pounding on the table that goes along with the insistent repetition of the claim of purely biological differences, as if pounding and repetition make it so. The pounding is a way of building a fact through a repetitive exercise, perhaps even an operation of gestic performativity. The effort to separate out the biological body from its environment presupposes that the environment is not already in the body, part of its very formation. If the environment is understood as a surrounding external reality, separate and distanced from that biological self, then no account of the development or formation of that biological self is really possible. That world of social and economic infrastructure and living processes is one in which the biological body lives, stays alive. It is one in which life is already bound up with social and economic institutions linked with other forms of life. Indeed, the biological body lives only to the extent that it is connected to other life forms and an array of social systems and powers. those interactions are formative and, ideally, sustaining. The body would not be what it is without those connections staying alive, without those related lives, which means that the life of the body is already and continuously linked to other living forms. That formative interplay more closely describes what a body is, that is, its growth and mode of becoming, and its constitutive relationality. By that last phrase, I mean only the relations without which a body cannot be at all. The outside is constantly taken in order to live, which is why politics of food, water, air, and shelter are crucial to living on, and to living well. In its porosity, the body lets in the external world in order to survive, and when its boundaries are fully closed off from what is outside, it falters, it cannot breathe or eat, it cannot expel what it no longer needs. Thus it makes no sense to think of the body as a bounded entity which bears its sex as a simple attribute. If the body and its sex are both understood as relational, then the social has enveloped and entered us way before we enter into any deliberate relation with the social. We are, as it were, from the start, outside ourselves, in the hands of others, exposed to elements, such as air, nourishment, and shelter, and all of these externals become part of biological life, ingested, inhaled, incorporated, reproducing cells, and sometimes damaging them. If we care about eradicating environmental toxins and environmental racism, then we know that it is at the level of the particle that passes between the external world and the body that matters of life and death come to the fore. As a result, it makes no sense to think of the body as over here and the environment as over there, and then ask how the two come together. We have to start with the scene of interaction, interdependency, and reciprocal permeability, and then ask how the idea of a primary ontological separation between body and world came to be accepted as common sense in certain parts of the Western world. A living body is alive only by virtue of sustaining relations. So when we think about the body or gendered embodiment, we are always talking about those relations as well. Indeed, if we are not acted upon in some ways, if we do not take the external world in or find a way to be lodged there, we don't stand much chance of living on. The environment is thus not just over there at a distance from our bodies. We take in that environment as it takes us up, and the environment is fundamentally altered by human interventions and extractions. And climate change is a stark testimony to how those interventions can become destructive. None of us can be formed without a set of interventions, and those external impingements become the conditions of our emergence. They become part of who we are, intrinsic to our forms of becoming, which follow no one trajectory. In what